Okay, we are on the corner of West Middle and Washington Street, and in front of us is the Michael Jacobs house. Now, Michael lived here with his son Henry and their family here during the battle. In fact, this house was in his family from 1834 to 1901. Mr. Jacobs was a professor at the Pennsylvania College, which today is known as Gettysburg College. And he was an eyewitness and a recorder during the Battle of Gettysburg. While the Battle of Gettysburg was going on, the Jacobs family hid in the basement of the home and hid in the home. Just a few years previous to that, he had been the organizer of the Gettysburg Gas Works in 1859, and he was a prominent citizen. And during the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863, he recorded things in a notebook, including the temperature of the days during the three battles, and that's how today we know that it was a very hot battle. He was the first one to write a book on the Gettysburg campaign, which he published in the fall of 1863, right around the time that Abraham Lincoln came to visit the town. And one of the neatest things that happened with Professor Jacobs and his son was on July 3rd, just as the cannonade ended and Pickett's charge was about to happen, Professor Jacobs realized that something special was about to happen, and he called his son Henry up to the house. And while we go over here, there's a Civil War building sign I want to show you. But as he sensed something was happening, he called to his son Henry and said to him, "Come, quickly, come. You can now see what in your life you never will see again." This has been the home of Professor Michael Jacobs, eyewitness and recorder at the Battle of Gettysburg, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. On the Samuel Pitzer farm, also on the farm that contained Samuel Pitzer's schoolhouse, which was just over there in the distance. Now, this house is a old stone house. It's been covered up with weatherboard, but the house itself was built in 1794, along with the summer kitchen and the smokehouse. Now, the only thing on the summer kitchen that's still the original is the chimney that you see here. This was owned by a man named Samuel Pitzer during the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, and he had a 20-year-old son. Now, of course, on July 2nd, 1863, troops under Longstreet and also parts of Anderson's division, Wolford's brigade, and Barksdale's brigade bivouacked to the rear of the house here on the farm where you see the cattle here today. And I've done videos on Wolford's advancement here and his movements, as well as Barksdale near his wounding. So this would take place just before the attack of July 2nd. Now, the barn that you see there, it's actually being restored, and it was built, and it's a very large barn. It was built in the year 1806. So the house, smokehouse, and summer kitchen are all from 1794, making it one of the older houses here in Gettysburg. The barn was built in 1806. And of course, today this is part of the Gettysburg National Military Park, where they do restorations at. A lot of the restorations of different buildings originate here from this house. At one time, this house was actually part of President Eisenhower's estate, which is just over the ridge this direction here. Now, one interesting story about Mr. Pitzer's son, Samuel M. Pitzer, at the age of 20 on July 2nd, 1863, he was one of the few Gettysburg civilians seized by Confederate troops. And he writes, "I was taken on the 2nd day of July in 1863 and returned home on the 15th day of March, 1865. My full term in prison being 20 months and 13 days. I was taken at Pitzer's schoolhouse, not far from where I was born. My Uncle George Patterson was with me when I was taken by rebel sharpshooters that were hiding behind the schoolhouse. They did not find any firearms on us and assured us that we would not be held after a hearing. We were taken to Major Fairfax, and he said it was too late in the evening and put it off till morning. The next day, of course, the defeat occurred, and we were taken to Virginia. So Samuel M. Pitzer, who was the son of Samuel Pitzer, was taken here, not far from here rather, at Pitzer's schoolhouse. Now Pitzer's schoolhouse sat just on the other side of the house, and actually it was also used on July 2nd, 1863, as General James Longstreet's headquarters for a brief time. And if you go back and watch the video that I did 2 weeks ago on Longstreet's headquarters and the secret that the monument reveals, that it was in a schoolhouse about 800 yards from not far where the Longstreet Tower sits today. Again, this is a very beautiful farm and barn that's being restored. The house is a very historic house, being built in 1794. It sits here along Willoughby Run, and it's a part of the Second Day's battlefield, primarily the Second Day's battlefield here. This has been the Samuel Pitzer Farm and Schoolhouse on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. This is going to be the Samuel Pitzer Farm and Schoolhouse Part 2 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. We're going to take a little look here at the smokehouse. This is the original smokehouse from 1794. And when we look inside, you can still see some of the charred marks from where the smoke came out. And as we seen on the Kearns Farm video and talked about, the smokehouse allowed them to smoke all their meats, and it had holes drilled where the smoke could escape. This one's in really good shape. As we said earlier in part 1, the only thing left from the summer kitchen is the fireplace itself. Now, a summer kitchen was designed in the summertime for people to cook out here away from the main edifice of the house. That would keep the heat level down in the house. The meals would be prepared here in the summer kitchen, the smokehouse, of course, being very nearby, where the meats could be smoked. And of course, here working on the farm with cattle, you had your plentiful amount of meats here. One thing we didn't talk a lot about was the schoolhouse. Now, the schoolhouse sat over here where the Millerstown Pumping Station Road stop sign is here in the distance. Just on the right side of that stop sign, just over here in the field, sat Samuel Pitzer's schoolhouse, and it was a one-room schoolhouse. Early schooling, of course, schooling in the public schooling rather in the Gettysburg area went back to the 1830s. So and back then it was very simple. It was a few local families, children who would meet in a one-room schoolhouse and basically just be taught the simple basics of life: mathematics and science, writing and reading, learning your letters and numbers. It wasn't the educational system that we have today. And it was near, somewhere between where I'm standing now and the schoolhouse. According to Samuel M. Pitzer, he was caught behind the schoolhouse and taken prisoner. So it was right here in this area on July 2nd, 1863, that Samuel M. Pitzer, the 20-year-old son of Samuel Pitzer, was taken prisoner as a civilian, one of the few Gettysburg civilians to be taken prisoner. And one other thing we touched on, President Eisenhower, when he decided to purchase property here in Gettysburg, part of the property that he purchased was this farm, as well as what we know as the Eisenhower Historic Farm today. This was at one time part of the Eisenhower National Historic Site, and today it's owned by the National Park Service and used as the headquarters for all the restorations that go on. This has been part 2 of the Samuel Pitzer Farm and Samuel Pitzer Schoolhouse on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Street, and we're looking at these two buildings in front of the one on the left at 785 Baltimore Street and the one on the right that says Soldiers National Museum at 777 Baltimore Street. These two buildings are part of the Homestead of Gettysburg. Now the building on the right is a Civil War building, and in 1866 orphans from soldiers that were killed during the Civil War were in that building. In 1869 the building on the left was built as a school for those children. Now one of the stories that goes along with this building, and these buildings rather, is that of Sergeant Amos Homestead of the 154th New York Volunteers. On July 1st, 1863, during the retreat of the 11th Corps back into this area of Cemetery Hill, Amos Homestead, Sergeant Homestead, was killed over on Stratton Street, which today is North Stratton Street. Today, outside the Gettysburg Fire Department, sits a monument to him. When he was killed, his body was not identified. However, he did have a picture of his three children in his hand. When that picture was taken from his hand, that picture was printed across newspapers all across the North. And finally, a few months later, his wife, Felinda, seen the photograph and was able to identify the soldier who was killed as her husband, Sergeant Amos Homestead of the 154th New York Volunteers of the 11th Corps, who today is buried in the Gettysburg National Cemetery just behind this home. His three children later came here with Felinda and lived as orphan children. And this old orphans home and school is a result of the great media coverage at the time through the newspapers that was covered from that sad story of those three orphan children whose father, Amos Homestead, had been killed here at Gettysburg. So again, this is the homestead of the Orphans Home of Gettysburg on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. 3 Carlisle Street here, and this is going to be our InTown series here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And the house that we're looking at here was built in the year 1860, and it was known as the Jacob Sheeds House. Now this house has the honor of also being a field hospital. For in this house, a man named William Hollis Bowley, who was in the 2nd Maryland Confederate Regiment, was wounded on Culp's Hill mortally on July the 2nd, 1863, not too far from the very angle at Culp's Hill where their monument is placed today. And if you want to go back and watch our video on the secret Confederate burial trench, it's right there that we started the video at the 2nd Maryland Monument. Well, William Hollis Bowley was mortally wounded on Culp's Hill on July 2nd, and he was brought to this house. And it was here at this house that he passed away on July 15th, 1863, 13 days after he was wounded. So not only was this house a field hospital, but a Confederate soldier died in this very house. This has been the Jacob Sheeds House here at 143 Carlisle Street and Field Hospital in our InTown series here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. 221 Chambersburg Street, and the house that we're looking at is the David Troxell House. Now the David Troxell House, which again is located at 221 Chambersburg Street, was owned by a harness maker. Now in 1863, the basement of the house recessed from the street. And during the battle, 22 civilians that lived in the building next to it, which was the Warren Block, actually hid in the basement of the David Troxell House. This house does have battle damage, which we're going to go over and take a look at here in just a second when I can cross the road. Now the battle damage that's in this house most likely comes from a shell that was fired somewhere from East Cemetery Hill, and it sits here above the window on the right hand side. This has been the David Troxell House on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. House on Baltimore Street. This house was actually built in 1810, and then a man named John McFarland built the brick structure in 1833. So this current structure up here is from 1833. Now, during the Battle of Gettysburg, the Sweeney family lived in the house. They were the ones that were living in it during the Battle of Gettysburg, and of course, it was here in this house during the Battle of Gettysburg that Confederate sharpshooters went into the attic and began dueling with Union sharpshooters on East Cemetery Hill. Thus, the battle damage on the southern side of the house, which is very evident even to this day. There's also a very good possibility that the Confederate sharpshooter that was in this window up here may have been the one to fire the shot that killed Jenny Wade early in the morning of July 3rd, 1863. Of course, today this house is a inn and restaurant, and it is in the memory of Elon J. Farnsworth, and thus called the Farnsworth House Dining. But again, to historians, this is the Sweeney House, built in the year 1833, used by Confederate sharpshooters during the battle, still sustains heavy damage to its southern wall here on the side of the brick structure. This has been the Sweeney House on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Looking at our group of houses, rather, is known as the Warren Block. And the Warren Block was built in the year 1852. It was commissioned by a man named Thomas Warren. Today, the addresses of the Warren Block is 211 through 217 Chambersburg Street here in Gettysburg. Again, Thomas Warren was the one that commissioned this brick building. It was basically rental properties, 4 different homes. The very first home on the left was occupied in the battle by Joseph and Sarah Broadhead, and it was Sarah Broadhead who wrote some diaries and kept some diaries during the Battle of Gettysburg about her care of wounded troops. The next, or the second house was lived in by a man named George G. Myers. The third one was lived in by a man named Jacob W. Gilbert, and then the fourth one, or the last one on the block, was owned, or lived in rather, by Owen R. Davis. Again, this is one of the historic Civil War buildings here in Gettysburg, and it's located at 211 through 217 Chambersburg Street, known as the Warren Block. This has been the InTown series, the Warren Block, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook.